about that card. So, Judges chapter 13, verses 24 and 25, the Bible says, "And the woman bare a son, and called his name Samson, and the child grew, and the Lord blessed him." It says, "And the Spirit of the Lord began to move him at times in the camp of Dan between Zorah and Eshtaol. And Samson went down to Timnath and saw a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines." Verse 2 of chapter 14, "And he came up and told his father and mother and said, I have seen a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for to me to wife." Whenever I mention the word Samson, and we play the game of word association, most of the time when I mention the word Samson, the word that automatically comes to most people's minds is the word strength. You see a man in the Bible who performed just unprecedented acts of greatness with this strength that was endued upon him by the Holy Spirit. And I mean, even many unchurched people, when they hear about Samson, they think of the word strength. But this morning, I would like to change your perspective. Because in reality, the word that ought to come to your mind when Samson is mentioned is not strength. It's weakness. Because it was Samson's weakness that destroyed him. But our perception of Samson really shows how our human mind works. In our humanity, we see Samson for his great feats of strength. And if we're not careful, we overlook his weaknesses that took him to a premature grave. Now, I know it's no fun for any of us to talk about our weaknesses. How many of you go to the Commons and before you play ping pong, you look at the guy across from you and say, "Now listen, by the way, my backhand really stinks. Don't hit it to this side." You know, how many of you before basketball season, you're greeting the other team and you say, "Hey, I just want you to know I stink. After 15 feet, I can't hit anything." Some of you here are like, "I can't hit anything if I'm under the basket." I mean, it's true. We don't like to talk about our weaknesses. Why? Because it's a very sensitive subject. Why? Because it sometimes exposes us. And if you expose your weakness to the enemy, that enemy is going to exploit it. But can I tell you, if you don't deal with your weaknesses, the enemy will exploit it. And so this morning, I want you to see Samson's weaknesses, and I want you to be candid about your own. Had Samson been candid about his own weaknesses, the book of Judges would have been written differently. If Samson had humbled himself and said, "I have a problem with pride, I have a problem with women, I have a problem with not being transparent," if Samson had been, if he had been humble during this season of his life, he never would have been caught by the Philistines and humiliated. And so with seeing what's at stake this morning, I want you to see the life of Samson. And I want to ask you this question: what is your weakness? I ask you that not because I want to exploit it. I ask you that because I want you to see it, and I want you to go to God with it, and I want you to get that reinforcement that you need so that you're not destroyed by your weaknesses like Samson was. So as we look at Samson's life in Judges 13, 14, and 15, and 16, I want to break it down into three ways. The first thing I want you to see is Samson's devotion. I want you to see how he started. In verses 24 and 25, his name was Samson. The child grew, and the Lord blessed him. Early on in his life, Samson knew what it was like to experience the blessings of God. He had been put in a good home. I'm sure he had been raised in a good fashion. And for many of you in this room, listen, you have a heritage that is every bit as rich as what Samson experienced. You've known what it's like for the Lord to bless you as you grow up through a youth group and as you grow up in a Christian home and you've been taught what's right. You've seen the blessings of obedience. And then in verse 25, and the Spirit of the Lord began to move him at times in the camp of Dan between Zor and Eshtaol. Not only do you find Samson early on, even in his infancy and his childhood, but apparently as he's growing up, now Samson knows what it's like to be used of God. God moves him mightily. Now some would interpret that, and it could be that maybe he was tearing up the enemy everywhere he went, as God would move upon him. But whatever the case, Samson knew what it was like to be used of God. But you know what? That didn't stop him from being overtaken by his weakness. I'm speaking to a group of people. Listen, at this age of your life, hopefully you're learning what it means to be used of God. You've experienced the blessings of God. You've been raised in a good home. You've been obedient. And now you find yourself where you're trying to make your decisions and determine your path. And even in college, you would say, there were times when I sat in chapel and God worked in my heart. There were times when I was at church and I just knew that God had used me and God was working in me and through me. Listen, I'm glad that you've had that kind of beginning, but listen to me, your beginning does not guarantee your end. Samson had great potential. Samson even knew what it was like to be used of the Lord. He knew what it was like to be raised in a good home. They prayed for him, and he was an answer to prayer. But in the end, that couldn't sustain him through a season of carnality in his life. But I want to hurry very quickly. I don't want you to just really see Samson's devotion. The biggest thing that I want you to see are Samson's decisions. Samson makes a series of decisions in Judges 14 through 16 that end up destroying him. And I really believe that these are sort of like a slippery slope. Now, you have to be careful. I've talked with people, they say, oh, the slippery slope. You use that slippery slope argument as if there is no such thing as a legitimate slippery slope argument. Now, I know, and I've dealt with it politically. I've talked to people, and I've talked to people about biblical issues, and they're like, oh, the slippery slope. You can make anything a slippery slope. And I say to them, would you just hush? There is a reality to this. I know it firsthand. When I was a kid growing up, I was at a public swimming pool, which is something that I wouldn't necessarily do today. But I was at a public swimming pool, and I could not swim a lick. And so life gets boring in the 4 foot or the 3 foot. And most pools that you go to, they have a slope. All right? And so, when you're about 8 or 9 or 10 years old and you're bored with the kiddie stuff, you just get over to the edge and you sort of feel that edge with your feet. And then you just sort of just kindly just make your way ever so slowly. I still can remember just making sure that I had my feet planted and just making my way down that slope. The water's about right here. You feel like you've really achieved something because you're no longer in the 4 foot and now you're, I guess, in the 5 foot. And, you feel it rising. Well, I remember as I was heading down that, one of my feet hit a patch of slime. You're like, what was that? I don't know, but when you're in public places like that, you can just mark it down. I'm sure it happens. And for a man who did not know how to swim, a young boy who did not know how to swim, my feet came out from under me, and the next thing I know, I am in the 8-foot section. And what I remember in those brief episodes of life is jumping and just flailing my arms, reaching the surface of the water, looking at the lifeguard, and the lifeguard just looks at me. And after 2 or 3 times of trying to be a bobber, I said, I've got to crawl back up this thing to get back. And just with everything that I had, I went down, and I was just pounding up that slope until I got back. You cannot tell me that you can't tell me there's no such thing as a slippery slope. And I really believe that it's really, it's something that people think in their minds. They want to get as close to the edge as they can, and they just make that provision for them. But there is such thing as a slippery slope. And you know what? When I read Judges 14 through 16, do you know what I see Samson doing? With every decision, he goes a little step farther. But by the time he hits Delilah, he hits a patch that throws him down into the depths, and there's nothing he can do about it. Young people, I want you to understand that Samson made several decisions, and I want you to see them. And I want to make sure that you stay off that slippery slope. The first decision he made was for a Philistine wife in chapter 14, verse 1. He went down to Timnath. He saw a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines, and he came up and told his father and mother and said, I've seen a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me to wife. Valentine's banquets were a little different back in Samson's day. None of this business of the man calling the girl's parents. Didn't work that way. Apparently, fellas, all you had to do was go talk to your dad. Say, Dad, that girl over there, I want her, get her. That's the only hope some of you guys would have, right? I don't know all the ins and outs of the culture, but listen, if Samson asked that, apparently it was a cultural thing. But, before you get so tied up about the method that he used to find a wife, you better understand the mistake he made was that he looked outside the Philistines and the Israelites, and his heart got set on a Philistine. Now, later on in the passage, the Bible does tell us that God would use this as an occasion to work in a way, but I still believe that Samson ran a stop sign. This morning, as I was pulling out on North Lee Street, I could walk to school, but sometimes I have to go somewhere afterwards, so I drive. Don't think me lazy. But as I pulled there at North Lee Street, I stopped, and boy, I'm glad I did, because there was a sheriff's deputy right over at the fire station, just sitting there watching me. Some of you are like, it probably was your son. If it was my son, he still would have given me a ticket. He would said, Dad, you remember how you raised me and you told me not to cross the line? Well, you just did, so I'm just practicing what you preach. But I'm going to tell you, I'm glad I stopped at that sign, because I'll tell you what, it would have cost me a little bit of money and a little bit of humiliation as some of you are driving by and like, well, I wonder why that guy's got his blue lights on behind Brother Beal's truck, and everybody sees it. There's some things in life that are just a stop sign. I mean, it's as clear as day. And if you run it, it's not because you didn't see the sign, it's because you didn't care about it. Samson made a decision for a Philistine wife. And young people, I want to remind you that when it comes for you seeking a spouse, and there's some of you like Langendorf and others here, you've got that already whipped. He's like, hey, I've got the best roommate in the world. And Luke Rogers would say, no, you don't. I do. These married guys, they love it. But can I just tell all of you, there's some places, listen, if you're single, there's just some places you ought not look. To a lost and dying world for a spouse, and it doesn't mean that we can't reach them, but listen, I'm just saying, when it comes to finding a spouse, God doesn't want you to be unequally yoked, and you don't have to pray about that. I know here we're all about praying about decisions, but that's one you don't have to pray about. You obey. And if there's some of you here and you've got your heart set on somebody that's outside these four walls and outside the walls of your church, and that flame is just growing in your heart, and you know that that person is not in any spiritual condition, the truth is you're probably not either, and you're just like, when that's burning in your heart, I'm saying be careful, there's a stop sign. Several years ago, I was out on the front porch. I saw Isaac Rivenbart and Brother Lucan out there sitting on the front porch the other day talking. It reminded me of COVID days. You remember that? Guys being put in quarantine and sitting out there sipping iced tea and couldn't smell it or taste it, but they were drinking it. I remember on that same porch, I talked with a young man who, you know what his nickname was when he came to school? His nickname was Solomon. And it wasn't because of the wisdom part. But I remember that young man had let his heart get so entangled with somebody, and it was a big flashing red light. I remember I sat on the front porch. This was a girl, she was unsaved. She just had no spiritual bearing whatsoever, but he'd let his heart get carried away. And I remember I sat out there with him, and I just bore my heart with him. Yeah, I was a dean of men, and he was a student, but this went beyond, I'm going to give you demerits. This is just like, this is the rest of your life, man. That was his last semester. He and that girl got connected. I never knew what happened to them until years later I got an email. He looked on the college website, got my email address, and he sent me an email, and he said, he introduced himself, and he said, do you remember that talk that we had on the front porch of the White House? I said to myself, I sure do. And he said, I wish I'd listened. His wife had left him, divorced him. He'd gone into the military. And in the email, he said, I'll never be able to really fulfill what God originally called me to do. His heart was just broken. He ran a stop sign. And people tried to help him. Samson made a decision for a Philistine wife. Samson also made a decision for honey. Verse number 8, after a time he returned to take her, and turned aside to see the carcass of a lion, and behold, there was a swarm of bees and honey in the carcass of the lion, and he took thereof in his hands, and went on eating, and came to his father and mother, and he gave them, and they did eat, but he told them not that he had taken the honey out of the carcass of the lion. Now, for you guys that are in my evangelistic preaching classes, now listen, I've just done something in this message that I typically would not do when I'm out and about. I've just skipped a large part of narrative because I believe that many of you are familiar with the story of Samson. All right? And for those of you like, what are you talking about? Listen, there are people out there today that are less and less familiar with the Bible, and when you're walking through and you start making assumptions left and right, sometimes they're disconnected because they don't know the story. But listen, for the sake of those of you who still may not know what I'm talking about, Samson killed a lion with his bare hands. Wouldn't you like to have seen that? Some of you are sneaking out here and you're walking through the woods just to get away, and a lion jumps out and your roommate just takes one paw and another and pops his arms right off. You're like, that's incredible. All right, Samson he took that lion and ripped him apart like it was just a babe. And he comes back later on and he sees that honey that's in the carcass of the lion, and he reaches down and he gets that honey. Now I want to remind you about honey. You're like, what's the big deal about honey? You go to Walmart now, you buy it. You're like, if I want honey, I just go. Listen, there was no Walmart back in Samson's day. And when you see honey that's in the wild, listen, it has a great draw. It's a great commodity. We're so cheap today because we just think, you just go and buy it. This was something that it was like, whoa, you don't see this very often. And he reaches down, he picks it up. But then in doing so, and in giving to his parents, he never tells his parents where it came from, and there's a reason why. The reason why is because Samson had taken a Nazirite vow and was not to touch an unclean thing. And just to get to the point, if it's dead, it's unclean. And Samson withheld it from his parents. He had a lack of transparency. Now, I'm just going to tell you something that I think you ought to think of as a general thing, whether you're married or not. Listen, I've been married for 26 years, but you know what? If I can't be transparent with my wife about things, something's wrong. If I have a corner of my life that I don't want her to know about, unless it's a surprise birthday party for her, there's something that's probably not right. And young people, it's a good gauge in your life. It may not be a perfect measure, but it's awful close, if not perfect. Listen, if you can't be transparent and you have to withhold from authority things conveniently for your own advantage, you can mark it down. There's something wrong. Let me tell you, a long time before Samson ever got to Delilah, he lacked transparency. It was part of that slope. I can't tell you what the future holds, but I can tell you, if you harbor a lack of transparency in your heart, I'm going to tell you there's only one way to go, and that's down. And I hope that when you go home for a break, and I hope when you come back, I hope your heart can be free and that you don't have to worry about any skeletons in the closet or looking behind yourself. Listen, Samson withheld that information from his parents because he knew he had violated what he was supposed to do. He made a decision for a Philistine wife. He made a decision for honey. Eventually, in Judges chapter 16 and verse 1, he makes a decision for immorality. Then went Samson to Gaza and saw there an harlot and went in unto her. Sometimes we don't realize it, but we get so caught up in a rush that our pursuit of physical pleasure becomes stronger than our pursuit of God. When immorality is present, it's because we have sought the physical pleasure more than we have sought the presence of God. You can't seek the presence of God and the power of God and pursue God as number one and have all these other things happen. When that's first and foremost, listen, you'll not pursue these other things. Now, I can tell you the answer is to get this out of your life and 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 get this out of your life. And I'm not saying that those things don't have a place, but if I tell you get all of this out of your life and I never tell you to pursue God primarily, you're not going to make it. You're going to depend on a lot of fences that are going to just fall over. If Samson had said, God gave me this strength to conquer the enemy, and he had a single focus of glorifying God, those things would have never been a temptation to him. So what am I telling you? I'm telling you over the break, hey, instead of your number one pursuit being him or her, make your number one pursuit being God, and you'll be where you need to be. You say, how does that work? Well, when he's like, hey, why don't we go do this? And you have to say, well, I'm following the Lord. I don't think the Lord would be too pleased with that. You say, well, that might turn him off. Well, great. That's just fine. She says, well, I think we ought to do this. And you're like, you're following the Lord. And you're like, yeah, I know, but I'll tell you, the Lord, I just don't think He's big on that. And I'm more interested in following Him than you. Samson had a slippery slope of decisions. He made a decision for a Philistine wife. He made a decision for honey and withheld from his parents. He made a decision eventually for immorality. At this point in his life, do you know what Samson had done? Samson had killed a lion with his bare hands. He killed 30 men of Askelon, and then he kills 1,000 Philistines with a jawbone of an ass. And he did all that empowered by the Spirit of God. And now you're going to see all that be flushed. Because after Samson's decisions, the last thing you see is Samson's destruction. Judges 16 is one of those passages, every time I read it, I get so frustrated. I know what's going to happen. We used to have a large swing set out here when we had a lot of married students. We had a lot of kids that would be out here. And I remember my son Jared, when he was like 2 years old, Jared was he's thankfully he's gotten away from this, but he could just walk out in front of a car and not think twice about it, just not paying attention. And I remember I was sitting out here one day and I was watching the kids play and watching Jared run around, and the thought occurred to me, I thought, I know what's going to happen. Those kids are going to be swinging, and he's just going to walk right by when they're swinging, and one of them's just going to plow him. And that's exactly what happened. I just knew it. I saw the propensity there, and bam! He is walking, and he is like right at the opportune plate where it's just like, you just watch him, he just gets launched and lands. And when I read Judges 16, I'm going to tell you, my heart's pent up with anguish. And the reason why is because I read it and this guy is walking to his grave and won't listen and wake up. I'm going to tell you what, there's something more frustrating than showing up for a class and not knowing the answers. And that's watching somebody walk to their destruction and they won't listen to a word you say. I've been there and done that. I remember one time years ago, there was a young man that I had in my office. He was so full of pride. And I sat him aside his senior year and I said, man, I'm going to tell you something. If your wife has to live up to your expectations, even the best of women are going to leave you. Because no woman is going to take being put down like that, and no woman is going to be able to take the badgering of being held to perfection, and you demand perfection in her life, and you've got a big truckload of pride in your life. I said, buddy, I'm telling you, you are headed for trouble. And by the time we ended the meeting, he let me know he was appalled that I'd even talked to him that way. And his dad called me and let me know the same thing. But I didn't have any regret. And the reason I didn't have any regret is because I've seen it happen again and again and again. And sure enough, it unfolded that way. And young people, I'm telling you, you're in a great place where you've got people who have been around the block. You don't have graduate assistants who are about 3 years older than you teaching you. You've got some teachers that say, hey, listen, pay attention. And they see it. But yet they can't change your will. You know, 4 times Delilah comes to Samson. Now, usually I'd go through all 4 different temptations, but I'm not going to do that, or first solicitations. 4 times Delilah comes to him, asks for the secret of his strength, and 3 times Samson wakes up and he pops himself out of it. Now, I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer, but if you're asking me for my weakness, and 3 times in a row you do the very thing that I said is my weakness, and you tie me up, you know, we laugh, and I laugh inside too. But the thing that makes me weep is the 4th time. It's a horrible thing. Samson didn't even know that the Lord had departed from him, and now he is bound by the Philistines. There's a feeling that I never want to have. I never want to have that feeling that Samson did. I'm afraid of it. And I say that to you this morning, listen, knowing, take heed lest you fall. Every one of us, listen, it's a possibility. But I'll tell you, one thing that horrifies me is to wake up and to know that I will never be able to accomplish the purpose that God called me to do to the fullest extent because I've limited myself. Listen, there's some of you in this room, you've got some weaknesses, and maybe people have told you about them, and you've just brushed them off. Well, I'll tell you what, just think about Samson. He was so drunken with his own lust that he could not see what Delilah was doing. He's delivered to the enemy, and he's maimed, plucked out his eyes. He can still hear, but how would you like to, all you could hear is they're blaspheming God. Oh, we have conquered Samson, and they blaspheme Jehovah. It's bad enough to have your eyes plucked out. It's even worse for your ears to be filled with cursing to God. And the enemy rejoiced, and Samson was humiliated. How did he get here? By a slippery slope. He lacked transparency. He indulged in his flesh, and it led him right to his ruin. You know, some people get to the end of this story of Samson. You know, they like to make Bible stories into movies. Maybe if they haven't done it yet, somebody will say, oh, the story of Samson. Can you imagine Samson standing at the pillars and pushing and destroying all those Philistines? Boy, that must have been cool. He killed the whole crowd. He had vengeance on them. You know, to be quite honest, I don't think that's the greatest ending. As a matter of fact, it's a horrible ending. Oh yeah, I know maybe thousands of Philistines were killed in an act of one man's vengeance. But I'll tell you, there's nothing cool about ruining your life and then just having the ashes of it to be used up and burned up at the end when you could have done so much more. Amen. The truth is, none of us in this room really understand what's at stake and what price we'll pay if we do what Samson did. Who knows how many Philistines would have been destroyed and how much land Israel could have conquered if Samson had just done what he was supposed to do. How many souls could be reached? How many churches could be planted? How many civilizations or even people groups could be impacted if you just keep your nose clean and to the grind and live for God? And so I want to challenge you, when you leave this place today, you better take inventory of your own soul and know your weaknesses. Because if you don't acknowledge your weakness, it could destroy you. I read the story years ago. It was back in 2007. There was an Interstate 35 in Minnesota. I had a roommate in college. He was from Minnesota. I had always said Minnesota. You know, he would always correct me. He says Minnesota, not Minnesota. It's not a D, it's a T. He also thought that a water fountain was a bubbler and that a toboggan was something that you went in the snow with. Crazy, man. Toboggan's a knit cap you pull over your head. A water fountain's a water fountain. Now, Miss Drea is probably just writhing in anger right now. She's like, oh, because I've heard her talk about, you know, some of those. She likes, cheese curds and everything else too. But in the state of Minnesota, in 2007, there was a 1,900-foot bridge that collapsed. You imagine, you're going out of Lattimore, it's like 50 feet. I mean, a 1,900-foot bridge collapsed. 145 people were injured. 13 were killed, and 8 lanes of traffic collapsed. And you know, it was after that the Department of Transportation did a survey to try to find out what happened. And do you know what they learned? They learned that as far back as 1990, inspections had been done on that bridge. And those inspections said structural fatigue and fatigue cracks. And nobody did anything about it. And over 150 people were either killed or injured. If you're here this morning and the Holy Spirit of God works in your heart and shows you a weakness, instead of shelving it like they did in 1990 and waiting for destruction in 2007, how about being candid before God and being repentant and running to Him and humbling yourself and have a life ahead of you serving God? Don't you leave this place thinking Samson was strong. Samson was weak. Because he did what many of us do, we cover our weaknesses instead of